Welcome to the Partnership for the Public Good short video training. My name is Regine Danga. I am a Community Health Equity Project Manager, and today we are going to talk about lobby and advocacy as nonprofit organization. We will be covering rules on advocacy versus lobby. We are going to explore the difference of lobby versus advocacy. And we also talk about the types of lobby, how much lobby can you do as a nonprofit, and when you do lobby, what do you need to do to report how many hours you're spending on lobby. So Before before I introduce our instructor for today or our facilitator for today, which is Sarah and Andrea, I just want to say a disclaimer. This presentation is not meant to be legal advice. This is based on our understanding of existing resources on this topic. Please consult with your local attorney if you have questions about your particular situation. I'm going to take this opportunity for Sarah and Andrea to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Regine. My name is Andrea O'Sullivan. I'm Executive Director at Partnership for the Public Good, and I'll turn it to Sarah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Wooten. I'm the Director of Community Research at Partnership for the Public Good, and I will pass it back to Andrea.
Wonderful. So to kick off, we're going to dive right into advocacy versus lobbying. As nonprofits, we can do all of the advocacy that we want. This advocacy is an activity or communication that supports a cause or proposal. This can be public education, nonpartisan voter education, meeting with to educate elected officials about a general topic. It can be all of our coalition building work, community organizing. Advocacy then can also be lobbying and partisan political work. And those are the two areas where there are limits on nonprofits. You can see we have lobbying in yellow because you are allowed to do it with limits. And we have partisan political work in red because as 501c3 nonprofits, we cannot do partisan political work. But all those other forms of advocacy, education, public engagement, putting out research, building coalitions around certain topics are absolutely allowed activities under nonprofits. When we talk about lobbying, we are going to get in the reporting section to two types of tests that the IRS uses for is a nonprofit doing too much lobbying or not. And we're going to recommend that everyone use the 501h expenditures test. So we'll talk more about what that is and what those spending limits are for lobbying. But just know when we talk about that, we're using that approach. So lobbying then is trying to influence specific legislation or another official government action. And we'll look at some examples. Lobbying can also be encouraging the public to contact their lawmakers, their elected officials to influence legislation. So even if you are putting out a call, everyone please call your state senator to ask for this, that counts as lobbying. Under the other IRS test, the insubstantial parts test, anything that advocates for or against legislation counts as lobbying. But again, we're going to recommend that we're all using the 501h expenditures test for reasons that we'll get into. So can 501c3s lobby? The answer is yes. All of us 501c3 nonprofits are allowed to spend a portion of our time and our budget on lobbying. And we'll get into just how much of our time and budget we're allowed to spend on that later. Why should we lobby? We want to work toward equity for our communities and our clients. We want to work towards systemic solutions to injustice. We find at Partnership for the Public Good that many of our partners that are service providers and are seeing day in and out, what are the drivers of eviction? What are the causes of people ending up in the justice system, right? That as service providers, a lot of our partners can bring really unique perspective to say, here are the policy and systemic changes we could bring to really make changes in these areas. And you can see on this slide a couple pictures of where our partners have won some important local wins through legislative change. So first, we passed last year Erie County's language access law, The first language access law in New York State, adopted by county law, that will bring a much better level of interpretation and translation to Erie County public-facing services. In the picture below, we have Fostering Greatness and Foster Care Youth and Young Adults in Erie County, who came together to win the first budget line in Erie County dedicated to supporting people after they age out of foster care for their ongoing needs. And those are two examples where that work had to step beyond advocacy to lobbying. The Language Access Coalition actually drafted a law for Erie County and worked very closely with elected officials to move it forward. And the Foster Care Foster Alumni Coalition advocated very specifically for a new budget line, which required a legislative vote to adopt in the county. So that counted as lobbying as well. Here are some other examples to get us in the mindset of what is lobbying. If your groups meet with a New York State legislator to try to pass the Good Food New York bill, if you meet with a council member to urge them to increase funding for youth services in the annual city budget, if you ask your social media followers to call their council members and request that they adopt the good cause eviction law, that all counts as lobbying, and those are real examples from our partners where they've taken their advocacy priorities and lobbied for them to be adopted as legislation. Also, if you go out and talk with Buffalo residents and ask them to vote for the Equal Rights Amendment, that counts as lobbying because it is on the ballot as a ballot proposal or a referendum. So that is one example where community education and speaking with residents can count as lobbying if you're asking them to vote a particular way on their ballot on a policy referendum proposal. Again, when we talk about lobbying, there are two levels we can look at. One is direct, communicating with a member of a legislative body, with an elected official, with their staff, or any government official who's involved with creating or changing legislation. So it might be an elected official in the city council. It could also be a government official who is working in a city hall department if they're working directly on that legislation and drafting with you and working on the policy. For grassroots lobbying, again, that's communicating with the public and asking them to take action on a piece of legislation. So we have a little social media action alert here on the slide as an example from our partners. Tell New York lawmakers to pass elder parole and fair and timely parole. And maybe when you click that link, you're getting a directory. Call your assembly member, find your senator, here's their numbers, here's what we want you to ask them to do. And when you're guiding the public to take that specific action, asking their elected official to vote for a piece of legislation, then that's considered grassroots lobbying. Now, on the flip side, here are a bunch of advocacy examples that you can do that you don't have to count as lobbying when we get into how you're going to have to record and detail your time spent or your expenses on lobbying. So if you meet with a council member to educate them generally on what your organization does, this does not count as lobbying. If you meet with a state legislator to talk about the importance of clean water or to talk about the importance of healthy housing, that does not count as lobbying as long as you're not discussing a particular bill. So you might meet with a local state senator and say, we are noticing lead poisoning in many of the children that we serve. Here's what that's causing. Here's what we think about it. But if you're not saying, that's why you should vote for this bill that would change these rules about lead, right? Then you don't have to kick it into your lobbying recording. Similarly, educating the public on the dangers of lead poisoning, meeting with the city commissioner of inspections to ask that the department work on hiring more inspectors who live in the neighborhoods they inspect. That's an internal policy change. It doesn't require a legislative vote for the department to do that, so it is advocacy and not counted as lobbying in your nonprofit activity. Other things your organization can do to try to influence that would not be considered lobbying is you could try to influence administrative rulemaking or other action, again, internal to government departments. You could try to influence executive action that is not subject to federal or state legislative approval. And you can try to influence local actions by special bodies like the zoning board and the school board, things that don't require a legislative vote. Now I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so near the beginning, Andrea mentioned that there are 2 tests for determining how much lobbying that you can do. And under the one that most people would recommend, this 501H expenditures test, there's a certain definition of lobbying. And under the other test, there's a different definition. So these are some examples of things that would be considered advocacy, not lobbying, under the 501H expenditures test. So, as an example, educating the public about the good cause eviction bill and why it would be good for our city. So, in this example, you're talking to residents about the bill and you're saying, you support it, but you're not telling them to go talk to an elected official. And so, for that reason, it's not considered lobbying. Similarly, talking to residents about why the mayor and council members should dedicate more city funding to youth services. Dedicating more city funding requires a vote. However, you are not telling residents to go talk to their council members or the mayor about this. And so this again is not considered lobbying. It's just considered another form of advocacy. Another example would be posting on social media about why your organization supports rent stabilization for the city of Buffalo. Again, you're just expressing, your organization's opinion on this particular legislation, but you're not telling elected officials to vote a certain way, and you're not telling people in the public to go tell their elected officials to vote about it in a certain way. And so for that reason, it's considered advocacy, not lobbying. However, all of that changes if you're using the insubstantial parts test. And we're going to talk more about the differences between the two, but this is to give you an example of the lobbying definition for the insubstantial parts test is quite different than the expenditures test. For the insubstantial parts test, the definition is a lot narrower, and really anytime that you're expressing an opinion about some kind of proposed legislation or proposed vote, even if you're not asking residents to go talk to their elected officials, or even if you're not telling elected officials how to vote on it, that could be considered lobbying under the insubstantial parts test. So just keep that in mind, and we'll get back to these tests in a minute. So here's an example where, we want you to think about whether or not this is lobbying or just another form of advocacy. So meeting with Councilmember Nowakowski to request that he urge the inspections department to implement the city's existing PRI law. So you're asking a council member a question, you want them to go talk to a department to implement an existing law. Would this be lobbying? No, this wouldn't be lobbying because the law is already on the books. You're not asking the council member to vote a certain way on a proposed piece of legislation. You're just asking him to influence the department of the city to implement that law. So that would just be considered general advocacy. Here's another example. How about creating a one-pager, so creating some kind of explainer about why the city of Buffalo should adopt the good cause eviction law. So here you're educating the public about, your feelings about this law. Would that be considered lobbying? This one, it depends, because like we were talking about a minute ago with the 501H expenditures test, this wouldn't be considered lobbying because there's no call to action. You're educating people broadly, but you're not asking them to go talk to their elected officials, and you aren't talking to elected officials directly about this. And so for that reason, it's considered general advocacy. But if your organization is using the insubstantial parts test, this would be considered lobbying because you're talking about your feelings about a particular piece of legislation. You're expressing an opinion about it, and it hasn't been passed yet, and so in that way it could be considered lobbying. There is an exemption overall to some forms of lobbying. So it's called the self-defense exemption. There are some others as well, but this is a key one. If there is legislation proposed that threatens a nonprofit's existence, powers, duties, tax-exempt status, or deductibility of contributions, then when you're speaking to legislators about this thing, it wouldn't be considered lobbying. So if Congress is considering taking away tax exempt status from all current nonprofits, and that would apply to your nonprofit, then speaking with a legislator to say, we don't want this to happen, wouldn't be considered lobbying because you're defending your nonprofit's right to exist, essentially. Okay, so now getting back to the tests here. How do we determine how much lobbying is okay? Well, the IRS says that a nonprofit's lobbying activities can't be a, quote, substantial part of their activities. And again, it depends on which test you're using to determine what a substantial part is. So the 501H expenditures test is, the one that's pretty highly recommended, is one that you have to opt into. And it's very easy. You just file one piece of paperwork with the IRS and that's it. You've opted into this test. With this test, you are tracking the amount of money that you spend on lobbying. So that includes staff time and whatever that equates to. And, say if you organize a trip to Albany to advocate, to lobby for something with a group of people, and you're renting a truck and you're buying lunch for people, then all of that money spent counts as money that would, be recorded under this test. However, you are not counting time necessarily. So if a volunteer is coming with you to a lobby visit, you wouldn't record that because it doesn't cost money because they're a volunteer. You're just tracking money. Under this test, there's also a clear definition of lobbying and limits. So we'll talk about the limits in a second, but we had that clear definition before of lobbying where you're going to some kind of legislator and asking them to vote a certain way on something, or you're just discussing something that would require a vote, or you're asking the public to go and tell their legislators to vote a certain way. So it's got this relatively narrow definition of lobbying compared to the other test. And because of this, it generally allows an organization to do more lobbying. Versus the insubstantial part test, you're tracking money and time. So not just the money like we talked about, but also the time. So volunteer time would count. So that would take away from your limit. It also doesn't have a clear definition of lobbying limits. There's not the same kind of numerical limit like we'll talk about in the 501 expenditures test. And it's also got that broader definition of lobbying where really anytime you're expressing an opinion about some kind of legislation or something that needs to be voted on, that could count as lobbying, whereas it wouldn't under the 501H expenditures test. And for all of these reasons, you're generally allowed to do less lobbying as a result of being under the insubstantial parts test. But you automatically, as an organization, are going to be judged by the insubstantial parts test by default, unless you file that one piece of paper to say that you want to use the 501H expenditures test. Churches, houses of worship are one of the exceptions to this. They can't necessarily choose which test they're going to be using. They just by default have to use the insubstantial parts test, and they can't send in that paperwork to make that difference. So the specific limits on the expenditures test, this table gives you a sense of it. It's kind of a lot to look at, but you would go based on really your org's budget. So say you have a budget of $500,000, you can spend 20% of that budget up to $100,000 on lobbying, which is probably much more than you would ever need to. So it's a pretty high bar for how much lobbying you're able to do. If you had, for example, a $700,000 budget, you would get that first $100,000 of lobbying, and then you would get 15% of whatever that excess is over 500. So for a $700,000 budget, that's $200,000 in excess over 500, which means, and it's 15% of that, so you would get an additional $30,000. So you get $130,000 to lobby with. And just a little note at the bottom here, there are some things that you can take out of the calculation of your budget if you have an unrelated trade or business, or if you're a pass-through organization for another organization, you can take some of that money out of the budget that you're using to figure out which bracket you're in over here on the left-hand side. If that's too much math, you don't want to deal with it, this is a great tool from Alliance for Justice where you can just check it out. And I believe it's an Excel sheet where you can just plug in some numbers and it'll tell you exactly what your lobbying limit would be under the expenditures test. One note too, Andrea had talked earlier about grassroots lobbying. So that's where you're asking members of the public to contact elected officials about some kind of decision to be voted on. There is a restriction through the expenditures test that the amount of grassroots lobbying that you can do must be less than 25% of the organization's total lobbying allowance. So if you're allowed $100,000 worth of lobbying, then only $25,000 of that can go toward grassroots lobbying. And keep in mind, this includes creating social media graphics too. So the time that you spend on that would have to be counted as part of this reporting. Which brings us on to reporting. So to lobby, you must, well, if you want to be using that expenditures test, you file IRS Form 5768. You just do it once, and then from then on, the IRS is judging you according to that 501H expenditures test. You also need to report your lobbying activities on your 990 each year, and I'll give an example of that in a second. And if you're doing more than $5,000 worth of lobbying per year in New York State, you need to register as a lobbyist. At PPG, we generally don't go over that amount, so I don't think we've registered as a lobbyist, but maybe you would, depending on how much lobbying you plan to do. But otherwise, you don't need to worry about that. This is an example of a tracker that we use to figure out how much we need to report on our 990 each year. So this is just a simple Excel sheet that shows who the staff member is, what date they're lobbying, what the subject of the lobbying visit is, what level of government it's at, whether it's direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying, who the target is, and the amount of time spent. And then related expenses, like we talked about before, if you're doing some visit where you're traveling, you have to pay, whatever the case is, that would go in there as well. And then on the back end, someone on our staff will calculate what proportion of that staff member's salary does, an hour represent, and therefore how much we would charge for that lobby visit. Andrea, can I pass it over to you to talk about these resources?
Absolutely. So much of what we have learned about lobbying versus advocacy and what nonprofits should know if they are going to do lobbying comes from Boulder Advocacy, which is a project of Alliance for Justice that has many, many online resources. You can look up guides for what to do if you're going to lobby. If you also are getting into election-related public advocacy, they have checklists and guides about that as well. And then finally, they also even have a question line, a hotline. So you can find on the Alliance for Justice website a place where you can call or email in a question. If you're not sure, does this count as lobbying? Am I allowed to do this? We're having trouble recording what we're doing. And they have attorneys that will get back to you, which we've used that ourselves a couple times and had a great experience using it. So we really recommend their resources. And with that, thank you everyone for watching, and we will see you on another training.